Thanks, Jeff. I'd like to thank the FDA for hosting this conference and what I am sure will be an engaging 2 days of presentations. In particular, I'd like to thank you, Jeff, for inviting me to provide these keynote remarks. When Jeff first invited me, he suggested I should provide motivational and inspiring remarks. In truth, I'm inspired by each of you who do what you do every day to help bring new therapies to patients. In preparing for this presentation, for some reason, I began thinking about the book, Everything I Need to Know I Learned in Kindergarten. With respect to startups, everything I need to know I began to learn in my first startup. After being involved in well over 100 startups now, there are a few keys I think continue to hold true, although they may seem elementary. But in my experience, these traits are key to success. Thinking about these traits and who I've worked with over the years that has also inspired me, there is one individual who I'll share experiences from that hopefully likewise inspire you, but also reinforce the importance of these traits, which I've pulled together under the heading of innovation mindset. I'll do my best this morning to offer a few thoughts I hope will serve you well on your journey. I spent the first half of my career as an entrepreneur. I launched 2 companies, received a few patents, and developed new products, raised investment capital, and scaled these businesses. I've also spent time as an investor, and for the past 15 years, I've worked with scientists and entrepreneurs to help them achieve their vision. I'm passionate about this work because I'm passionate about pursuing new ideas to help commercialize new treatments. There are 2 things I've learned about myself over the years that I think apply to our discussion today. First, I'm intellectually curious. In my work, I'm exposed to an incredible array of great ideas, and I've been fortunate to work alongside true pioneers in their fields. While I will never achieve a deep knowledge the likes of which these individuals possess, it is inspiring to be exposed to the pioneering research and the promising results it may bring. Second, I've learned the importance of having an innovation mindset. To me, this means approaching my work each day with the openness of thought to explore new ideas, and to do so in a manner that invites others to be part of that exploration. Before we delve into innovation mindset, at the risk of telling this audience something you already know, science is hard. Pursuits in drug discovery and development require a precision understanding of so many moving parts, and yet biology is an unwilling participant, always changing, acting unpredictably. And yet, we desire to do the difficult and daunting work to discover and develop new drugs. Before we discuss ways in which I believe we can improve our chances for success, let's first consider the challenges we choose to accept every day, perhaps without actively considering them. According to a recent study by the Tufts Center for the Study of Drug Development, the cost per approved drug is $2.6 billion. This includes an average direct cost of $1.4 billion, as well as the time cost of capital of almost $1.2 billion, while investors forego expected returns while a drug is in development. If these numbers aren't sobering enough, let's first consider the following. First, approximately 1 in 5 to 10,000 compounds will become an FDA-approved drug. Statistically, that means only about 10% of you in today's audience will succeed in seeing their work become an approved drug. Second, if you happen to have that $1.2 billion that investors forego during the development of just one drug, let's say you took that money a couple of years ago and invested it into a risky stock at that time, perhaps a stock, say, like Tesla. If you were prescient enough to have done this, and did so for as long as it takes the average time it takes to develop a new drug, you would have today over $106 billion in your bank account. By comparison, there are only 2 drugs that have ever generated more sales all time. And third, consider the total money invested in drug development annually into compounds that fail to become approved drugs exceeds the gross domestic product of a number of countries around the globe. So, now that you have a sobering perspective of the challenges we face every day, let's talk about why we do this work and how we might improve our chances for success. Like virtually every one of you, my life has been touched by cancer and other terrible diseases. I've lost family members and close friends, and each time I wished there were available treatments, or better yet, a cure. When I was young, my stepmom passed away from acute lymphocytic leukemia. Many of you know the devastating effects ALL can have on the human body. About 30 years later, I was fortunate to work with a group that developed an incredible treatment for ALL. I worked passionately with this group to help form a startup company to bring new treatments to a new generation of patients because I had both a personal connection and an intellectual curiosity that drove me. In preparing for this discussion, I thought the following video might provide a bit of that inspirational reminder of why we choose to do what we do.
It was amazing. When she was born on May 2nd of 2005, she weighed 10 pounds, had a full head of hair.
When she came into our lives, she completely turned it upside down, but in a good way. She just has a ton of energy and likes to get up early and stay up late, and she's just been a blessing to us.
My name is Emily. My favorite color is purple, and pink and bluish greenish.
She's just a really creative little girl. She loves to draw and paint and do crafts. We think that she's just really strong and really brave because of what she went through. She went through 16 months of chemotherapy. She was supposed to go through a total of 26 months, and we got to 16 months of treatment when we found out that she had relapsed. The chemotherapy didn't work, and our hospital there told us that there wasn't anything else that they could do, and so they said that we could take her home and we would have a few weeks with her, or possibly a few months.
It even got to a point where Carrie had to stop doing research because the research showed that she wasn't going to survive. So I would tell her, no one has done a study on Emily yet. It's not an option not to have a positive outcome here, and it's going to happen.
Emily came to us in April of 2012. She had been in the hospital for nearly a year and was unable to get into remission. She was the first child enrolled on our protocol, and so we had a lot of doubts as whether the infused killer T cells that we made would be able to keep up with the rapidly progressing leukemia cells.
Some parents naturally would think of, I'm not sure if I just want my child to be a scientific experiment, but trying these experimental studies is what leads to breakthroughs.
I had read that immunotherapy was what doctors and researchers were kind of going towards, to use your immune system to fight cancer. The way that they explained it to us in kind of simple terms was that they would take her T cells out of her blood and that they would train them in a lab, or that they would send them to boot camp. Then we're going to put them back into your blood, and those cells are going to find cancer cells in your body and they're going to get rid of them. They had expected her to get a fever about 7 to 10 days after the T cells. She was on a ventilator for 2 weeks, but once she got on the ventilator, I think the doctors and researchers realized that it was because the T cells were actually working.
And my cell phone rang.
He looked like he was in a daze and he was just staring at his phone. And I said, "What's wrong? There must be something wrong." And he said, "No." He said, "Dr. Gupp just called me and he said the T cells worked." He said she's in remission.
It's been an amazing journey for me. It's been over 20 years that I've been working on this, so that's obviously very rewarding. There's still a lot to do.
It's a remarkable time in immunotherapy today. Just a few years ago, I think there was still some skepticism that this area would be a viable way to treat cancer, and today there really isn't any doubt that these types of treatments hold enormous promise for a wide variety of cancers.
The exciting thing is we now have a lot of tools in the toolbox where before we didn't have these kind of potent targeted immune therapies.
For 60 years, our scientists have worked relentlessly to unlock the secrets of the immune system with the goal of understanding how to use its power against cancer. After decades of laboratory studies and clinical trials, we now have new treatments that are producing real successes. And this is just the beginning.
It's really exciting to be part of this revolution now, where we're seeing entirely new ways, and I think we'll see one day the end of cancer.
Yeah, it was June 1st of 2012. She was discharged from the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. When we left, some people from our community here in Phillipsburg said, "Could you keep us updated on your way home?" I said, "Oh, okay, sure." And we came into town, and I would guess that there was more than 1,000 people standing in the rain to welcome us home.
This is the first year that she's gone back to school where she has a full head of hair, and it's just really exciting to see her being excited about going back to school and being with her friends and just being able to have a normal childhood again. She's just like every other child now. I hope that one day, you know, when you're diagnosed with cancer, that they can say, we're going to give you this treatment, and in a couple of weeks your cancer is going to be gone. And you know, we used to give people this diagnosis, and it used to take years to finally say that your cancer is in remission or that your cancer is cured. And now we can do it in just a couple of weeks or a couple of months with very few side effects. I mean, that would be amazing.
Watching Emily's story unfold in real time has truly been a gift. In 2018, Time magazine's list of 100 most influential people included 18 heads of state, 32 celebrities, and 12 industry CEOs. It also included 4 scientists. One of these scientists, Dr. Carl June, was featured in the video you just saw. He's also a friend of mine who I've been privileged to work with. As many of you know, Carl is a pioneer in CAR-T technology and led the team that developed the first FDA-approved CAR-T treatment. In preparing for today's discussion, I asked Carl if he'd mind me sharing some anecdotes from our experiences together. What isn't evident from the video, unless you know Carl, is that he approaches his work with an innovation mindset. In other circles, some of these traits would be referred to as emotional intelligence, but I believe emotional intelligence simply provides a basis for an innovation mindset. Whether that work is in the lab or in navigating a startup, my experiences with Carl reaffirmed for me the importance of 3 themes that I would like to discuss today. The themes are being multicultural, being coachable, and being part of a team. When put into action, I believe these 3 themes help form the foundation of successful efforts to commercialize new drugs. Further, we'll discuss how each theme builds upon the next theme to offer what I hope you'll find are relatable ways of thinking about and approaching your work. Many of you already subscribe to or employ these themes, and if that's the case, perhaps this chat will support your sense of being on a good path. Before we should jump in, I should warn you that I'm more of a storyteller than a teacher. So with that in mind, let's jump in. What does it mean to be multilingual? Depending on the source, it can mean someone who speaks 3 or more languages. For my purposes, I'm going to bend the definition of multilingual, and I'm also going to bend the definition of language. In the world of drug development, I'd suggest there are at least 5 distinct languages. These include the science language, the clinical language, the regulatory language, the business language, and the consumer language. While fluency in at least one language is critical, fluency in 2 or more of these languages is indeed important in order to successfully communicate with others that you will depend upon and require strong relationships with in order to commercialize a drug. Before we explore these languages, here's my first story on why I believe multilingualism is important. When I was in high school, I met a girl and we began dating. We went on to marry, and we've been happily married for over 30 years. In the early days of our relationship, however, I made a miscalculation about the possibility of our future together. You see, it wasn't until about 6 months after we began dating that I found out her first language was actually Spanish and that her entire family was from Cuba. At the time, I didn't contemplate what it meant to be part of a multilingual or multicultural relationship of any kind. What I did think about was that I was incredibly lucky because I was at best a C student in high school Spanish and now had someone who could do my homework for me. Imagine that luck. So, as time went on, our relationship blossomed. I went from C's to A's in Spanish and all was good. That is, until about a year or so later when I was invited to meet the entire extended family over holiday dinner. It didn't occur to me until I was already into my first appetizer that everyone would be speaking Spanish. What did occur to me very quickly, though, was that impressing them with my command of the English language would be less than endearing. I did my best to utter a few words of Spanish, which garnered me a few smiles, although I was wondering if they were thinking my girlfriend had made a terrible choice. Shortly after that holiday experience, I spent time contemplating the fact that I'd need to truly learn Spanish if I was going to have a meaningful relationship with her family. What I also subsequently learned was that learning the language wasn't just to communicate. It was so that I could know what was being discussed. I needed to know when the family was talking about me. No, not behind my back like most families. Right out there in the open was what I was worried about. I actually also needed to learn more than the language. I needed to both learn and appreciate the culture. The value of learning to eat frijoles, ropa viejo, and plátanos went beyond just getting to eat great food. It allowed me to form strong and lasting relationships based on mutual respect and understanding. I've managed to learn and be somewhat conversant in the 5 languages of drug commercialization that I mentioned earlier. While I'm fluent in the business language, I've learned enough to respect and to avoid faux pas when speaking the consumer language, for example. I'll focus today mostly on the business language, as it is arguably the one that can be the most important in moving scientific work forward in a startup, owing to the significant investments required, as I mentioned earlier. While it is hard enough to learn a new language, let's also consider there are likely different dialects of this language you'll need to learn. For example, in Spanish, there are some Spaniards who speak Castilian Spanish who tend to speak with a lisp, doing so, according to legend, because a king in the 14th century spoke with a lisp. In business speak, venture capitalists will use terms like 2x preferred rights and value inflection point, while corporate accounting folks will use terms like distribution of proceeds calculation and increased balance sheet asset valuation. While the terms essentially mean something similar, venture capitalists and accountants may be focused on somewhat different aspects of these same issues. Consequently, learning the language of business can be both challenging and vital to your success. Unlike learning Spanish, however, it will be important to rely on multiple trusted teachers. There is no Rosetta Stone program for learning the language of business. Now, I know you may be thinking, I understand the importance of speaking these other languages to be able to communicate, but why is it such a big deal? The answer is not necessarily clear or consistent. That said, going back to my high school example, the answer does lay largely in the realm of fostering strong and trusted relationships. As a practical matter, scientists tend to hold their inventions as personal. After years of dedicated and painstaking work, it is natural to understand why scientists would take a proprietary view of their invention. By contrast, investors and corporations tend to have a somewhat dispassionate view of technology. It represents a vehicle to help drive a company to generate revenues. Investors feel strongly, however, that their capital, as well as their experience, likewise play a critical role in the success of a startup. Investors invest predominantly to achieve a return on their investment. With these seemingly different views, one can see the potential for distrust before a trusted relationship can be formed. I believe it is helpful to appreciate the importance of maintaining a balanced perspective on the relative contributions different individuals make to the success of a startup. By communicating across these multiple languages and perspectives, it is possible to form a mutual and shared understanding of value as well as establish trust. Thinking about my experiences working with Carl, I was always taken by how fluidly he could switch between languages, even during a single meeting. This really struck me during the J.P. Morgan Healthcare Conference. For those of you who may not be familiar, the J.P. Morgan Healthcare Conference, or JPM as it is known, is the largest healthcare investment conference in the country. Every life sciences company, venture capitalist, and entrepreneur descend on San Francisco for several days each year of rapid-fire meetings. Several years ago, I spent 2 solid days in meetings with Carl at JPM. This was on the heels of some very positive and public announcements about CAR-T technology, so as you might imagine, there was tremendous interest from venture capitalists. I reserved a private conference room and held back-to-back meetings every 90 minutes. This was at a point in time that we hadn't even formed a company yet. We were actually looking for venture capitalists to fund the company effectively as co-founders. Notwithstanding the publicity around CAR-Ts at the time, the questions would swing from the business to the science and back again at a dizzying pace. Some investors would challenge Carl on the science and even try to put him on the defensive. What impressed me more than anything was how he never got flustered. He patiently explained the science to the smallest level of detail, but also was able to link this back to how a drug would impact the market of current therapies. It fascinated me to watch as investors would quickly develop an appreciation for Carl, not only as a pioneering scientist, but as someone they could partner with and invest in. I believe Carl's multilingualism played a meaningful role in securing investors. Let's move on to the concept of being coachable. For context, I'll describe coachability in a business context. According to Forbes magazine, a person who is coachable not only responds well when given feedback, they actually ask for feedback. They view the input from others as a valuable tool in their development, and they are also willing to take actions and make personal changes based on this feedback. Now, there's a difference between having a coach and being coachable. For example, golfers have a coach to help them with their golf swing, and coaching in music has even become a form of entertainment on TV. In the startup environment, coaches come in several forms. These can include mentors, board members, and investors, just to name a few. Relationships can also be formal or informal. Now, this is not to suggest that everyone needs to have a coach. The key point I'm trying to make is that it is important to be coachable, particularly in a stressful environment like a startup. You simply must be receptive to feedback and be willing to act on that feedback. As a practical matter, startup growth is rarely a straight line, and plans are frequently altered as a company pivots to incorporate new dynamics. Thus, being flexible and open to feedback to make these pivots smoothly are an important predictor of a startup success. In the world of startups, being coachable is something that investors are listening for from the very moment you meet them. This is also true for entrepreneurs looking to partner with scientists and investors looking to invest in entrepreneurs. There are 2 key factors that underpin the importance of being coachable. First, no matter how innovative a technology may be, investors invest primarily in people, not in technology. The axiom in venture capital is that you bet on the jockey, not the horse. when betting on jockeys, venture capitalists prefer to bet on experienced jockeys, owing to the reality that experienced jockeys are able to pivot more quickly and in a direction that a startup will be more likely to succeed. Since there aren't enough experienced jockeys, we need to consider that new opportunities often come from scientists and entrepreneurs that have not been through the startup process before. The second reason coachability is important is that startups are a team sport. Building a team that works well together is a key to startup success. If a member of the leadership team is unwilling or unable to take direction well, or to relate successfully with those around them, the likelihood of failure increases dramatically. Being an active listener, taking in the feedback we're given, and incorporating into our future actions sounds simple enough, but is frequently forgotten. Now, it may not surprise you that it is frequently the inability to understand someone speaking another language that makes it difficult to listen and then act on feedback. In the academic environment, I find myself having discussions with researchers where I am trying to provide some coaching and the message just doesn't get through. This typically occurs for two related reasons. First, the researcher isn't looking or listening for any coaching. And second, I'm avoiding being too direct because I may be perceived as having an ulterior motive because I represent the university and not the researcher personally. In these instances, I try to establish a rapport first that builds confidence prior to any meaningful coaching. If you work in an academic environment or a startup, taking the time to engage and develop a network of individuals that can serve in a variety of ways, including coachable moments, can be truly valuable. If you are able to serve as a coach, keep in mind that the coaching may not always be perceived as being welcome because a relationship of trust and respect is still developing. In my next flashback sequence with Carl, I'll take you back to one of the earliest meetings I ever had with Carl and his team to discuss financial expectations for their startup. It was a late-night meeting in a conference room down the hall from his lab, and in addition to the team was the executive vice president of the university, who, by the way, I was pretty sure he was there to make sure I didn't screw things up, and that if I did screw things up, that he could be there to fire me on the spot. My first question to Carl was how much did he think this new company was worth? My next question to Carl was what percentage of the company did he and the team believe was appropriate for them to own? I remember thinking that my expectations were different from his, but I had no clue how the other folks around the table would react. And while I had no reason to expect they would view me as a coach, I approached my responses from that perspective. I led the discussion through the venture capital and management team perspectives, provided details and examples where I could, and even reached back to my business school days to write some calculations on the whiteboard. Throughout it all, Carl absorbed every detail. Perhaps more importantly, he never got upset when my math differed from his. Instead, he asked questions. He wanted to understand why investors and entrepreneurs commanded the equity percentages and salaries that they did. When we finished the meeting, he was appreciative for the discussion and the information. And during the meetings that followed, he was well prepared and employed the information for his benefit. It was also impressive to see that as he met with potential entrepreneurs and investors, he employed this same openness to learn and to likewise coach in areas of science. This coachability, combined with his ability to be multilingual, led to a rapid comfort for the entrepreneurs and investors that would ultimately help launch the company. Regardless of the newness and complexities of being a first-of-its-kind company, it quickly became clear that these future partners believed Carl and his team were individuals they could rely upon during the challenging early period of growing a startup. Growing up, you likely heard the phrase, there is no I in team many times. That said, what does it mean to be part of a team in a startup developing a therapeutic? When a startup is first launched, it typically means the team is small, perhaps less than 5 to 10 people, all of whom wear many hats. It's during this early phase that most startups fail, having little to nothing to do with the therapeutic asset itself. Companies typically fail at this stage because the team is either not comprised with the necessary talent and/or the team members don't interact successfully. The lack of a well-curated, interdisciplinary team will typically make raising capital and problem-solving incredibly difficult. As I discussed earlier, venture capitalists are looking at a team to mitigate risk, solve problems, and move a company forward effectively. Without a team-based mindset, beginning at the formation of a startup, issues often fester and become worse until the company fails. Most therapeutic startups launch during the preclinical phase of development. Given to the early and specific nature of this work, many companies don't envision the team they'll need down the line as they progress. Failure to plan for the evolving needs of a team is another aspect of team building we often see result in a company with a promising asset shut down. Questions such as, is the CEO and management team the one we need to take the company into clinical development? Or, does the nucleus of the team have the ability to communicate effectively with each other and with other stakeholders? Or, do we have the right people to problem solve effectively for difficult decisions? I don't often hear these questions being asked early by company founders and team members. Instead, these questions are often asked by institutional investors down the road when it is typically too late or too painful to course correct. Taking this a level deeper, startup teams are often formed by scientists developing a therapeutic asset and those in a proximal social or work orbit. When we look at the early makeup of these teams, we often find a lack of diverse training or experience. In the academic setting, there is also frequently a compounding factor, that is, a lack of routine exposure to entrepreneurs and investors. I believe this lack of routine interactions leads to a difficulty in appreciating the relative contributions and value, real and perceived, that various stakeholders need to make for a startup to succeed. We see this lack of appreciation lead to structural decisions such as distribution of founders' equity that make it challenging for future investors to reasonably put money into a company because the incentive alignment across each stakeholder is unbalanced. In my final flashback sequence with Carl, we look at how the team for his startup was developed and one of the most critical aspects for establishing the basis of a team, trust. Rather than recruit a CEO to form a team, we focused on recruiting an existing established team. By focusing on an existing established team, we sought a group that had previously worked together to move assets from preclinical phase to clinical phase to commercial phase and had a strong nucleus of players. This would provide a group where a novel set of assets and uncertain regulatory environment at the time would be navigated by an experienced team. This proved especially valuable when the early team members began meeting with Carl and his scientific co-founders. The approach made it easier to address complex strategies and brought forward a group with experience in overcoming challenges together. Perhaps one of the greatest benefits to this approach was that trust was able to be established quicker than is typical. I believe this occurred because the management team had existing trust with each other, as did the scientific team. When the two teams came together, the interactions were comfortable because they moved across multilingual conversations with individuals that had navigated challenges together in the past. The importance of team trust cannot be overstated. Perhaps the greatest thing to watch during several of these meetings were situations in which Carl could have easily put himself at the center of the discussion or even the center of the company. Instead, he repeatedly, almost instinctively, realized the importance of a team and the role each person had to play, including himself. The considerations around team selection are too numerous to cover in this discussion. Likewise, there are many reasons why having a team mindset, let alone a strong team, are important for developing therapeutics. Regardless of whether you are considering the formation of a startup or several years into a startup experience, I would suggest to you that managing this delicate dynamic is a critical and constant process that is vital to success. As we've explored these three themes, I hope you are able to consider how they impact the work you do as well as the work you seek to do in the future. I've seen people from scientists to entrepreneurs apply these themes successfully in their endeavors. I've also noticed the folks that have been most successful, such as Dr. June, have been able to layer each of these themes onto the next. That is, by learning to be multilingual, one acquires an ability to communicate and appreciate others from across an array of professional, educational, and social experiences. As a result, these individuals become more coachable. Owing to the exposure to these different individuals and experiences, a desire to gain a deeper knowledge and understanding of these skill sets for oneself becomes a very powerful driver. With the acquisition of deeper knowledge and understanding, we see these individuals appreciate and value the role they play on a team and the importance of roles with different expertise needed to play as well. Hopefully, each of these themes resonates with you regardless of whether you're thinking about launching a startup, you work at a startup, or even if you work at a big company. I believe these themes, which I roll up to form the basis of what I've referred to as an innovation mindset, are helpful guides as you pursue the challenging and rewarding work of bringing a new therapy to market. Thank you for allowing me the opportunity to speak with you today.
Thanks, Keith. That was motivating, warm, and experienced, just as anticipated. It was awesome. Let's look at the questions. And the first one is mine, and I guess that's a great aspect about moderating. I get to, and I'm almost expected to ask a question, and my questions are sometimes blunt, but this one is reality based. And when you're trying to guide investigators, what's the best way to help them understand, educate them that their idea has likely insurmountable issues, like it's not a good idea, that it's absolutely not a good idea. I know we shouldn't bang people over the head, but VC gets to say, thank you very much, we will be in contact. Your job is a little harder at an academic accelerator. For example, I have seen on multiple occasions where people want to inject hypochlorous acid intratumorally, bleach. What do you say, in what language? And then another question to that is who is funding this stuff?
Jeff, it's funny because I'm not a scientist, so I don't try and speak in the scientific language. Most people that are developing drugs, whether it's novel or questionable, have far more experience in their field than I do. So I try to take a partnered approach, and that the relationship that I was commenting on a few minutes ago, really try and have that set the basis. But like your question in terms of being blunt, I try to be blunt as well, because the reality is it's probably going to be easier to hear from me than from a venture capitalist, in part because I'm around to help, and you frequently only get one shot getting in front of a venture capitalist. And so I try to explain that the reality of the situation is such that the investors are going to be looking for what they believe to be a path forward. And even if your science is brilliant, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's investable. And there's sort of a short answer to this and a long answer to this. And since we don't have time for the long answer, I would say, realistically speaking, try to present in the realm of data, oftentimes showing that here are the deals that are being invested in, or I think oftentimes if you're not the first or second one to bring something forward, that the probability of raising an investment goes down precipitously. Because most of these folks are scientists, they tend to respond better if I can give something of a data-backed answer as opposed to an emotionally backed answer. And there are a few more moving parts to it, but just in the limited time, I would say trying to be direct, trying to explain that science doesn't carry the day. And in fact, investors tend to think about opportunity team first, actually, opportunity second, and science third. And when you can put it in that perspective, it can be a little bit sobering and a little bit challenging to accept, but the message tends to break through.
Thanks, Keith. So here's a question from our audience, and it goes, you have mentioned the questions you asked, such as what is the percentage of equity your team should own? Could you give us the answer after you discuss the questions with the scientific team and investors? I guess that question is, what should I expect? What's the answer to that? Like, what do you get as the founder, as the innovator?
So the axiom "you get what you negotiate" is typically true, but there are some standard data points. These are not from my experience, but from a venture capital fund that does a lot of investing in this space, particularly coming out of academic institutions. For scientists, academic scientists that are not going to be full-time in the company. They're not going to quit their university job and jump into the company. The average currently is only around 3 to 5% for an individual scientific co-founder. And so that number tends to be sometimes an order of magnitude lower than what folks were expecting. But that is right now about typical, whereas a founding CEO can command 20% plus or minus, and a team can command 60%. So the percentages vary. A lot of times, this will also depend on the relative experience the individuals bring. How much, for example, for the academic founder, they're going to need to be able to help transfer the knowledge into the company, and what their ongoing role will be. And sometimes it's not so much the equity you get up front, but what can also be earned over time, and ultimately how you'll support the team and hopefully make the equity be valuable. So few moving parts, but those are right now the numbers.
Can I follow up on that? So, FDA, we don't think about money, right? It's just not, it's not in our equations at all. It's risk, benefit, and money is not there. But 3 to 5%, is that when there's 5 co-founders across multiple institutions, that's 3 to 5% between 5 co-founders. And is that forever, or when the company gets bought out by multiple companies and later $5 billion later, they're still getting 3 to 5% of that, or that's all negotiated in some term sheets?
Well, usually founder stock dilutes over time, and unless you've got dollars to be investing alongside investors, which most scientific co-founders don't, that is diluted. The terms under which somebody can earn equity over time, as I said, tends to come more in a consulting agreement or serving as an advisor to the company or even as the chief scientific officer, where additional equity will be gained over time. And so what you see day in, day out varies somewhat based on the expected roles. It also depends on the investors. A lot of times, what we see is these first companies are being first round of investment is what we call the 3 F's: friends, family, and fools. And the equity divisions tend to be different from what downstream professional investors will expect. That can be right-sized a little bit at an angel round of investment, and I know we have speakers who probably speak to this later on today, but when professional venture capitalists tend to come on to make a first investment, oftentimes what will happen is any of these disparities will get righted, and some of it can be painful. Some of it also, if they can't be righted, will create a deal from being able to be invested in. So you really do see a range. Unfortunately, I've seen a bunch of horror stories over the years, and it's hard because there's really nobody to blame. There's no right or wrong. People are doing what they think is appropriate at the time without really just having the experience to understand that these downstream realities are going to, in almost every instance, kick in. Again, a lot of these answers, they depend on the unique circumstances of a deal, but most scientific co-founders are going to get diluted down. But if a company is sold for $1 billion and you have 1% of that $1 billion, obviously it's a lot of money. The advice I try to give is don't focus on the percentage, focus on the value. And the percentages are gonna be changing all the time. But the reality is if you can create value for that stock, the money tends to take care of itself.
Thanks, Keith. From a scientist's perspective, you can imagine my sentiment right now, which is not very speakable. I'm going to read another question from the audience here. Do you think there is a greater need to develop and coach, I'm not sure what TTO, of universities to nurture innovation and accelerate translational research? I know you're part of efforts like that.
Yeah. So TTO, or Technology Transfer Office, is the office most major universities have to manage the commercialization of all technologies, not just therapeutics. Like everything else, experience in tech transfer offices come in all shapes and sizes. At University of Utah, one of the things I'm responsible for is our tech transfer office, and I can tell you that after being there almost 5 years now, I felt that we didn't have some of the talent I wanted there when I first arrived, and we've done a lot of work to not only recruit new folks but also build new programs. And different universities are tending to bring more of these multilingual speakers on board, and I do believe it is important. I think at the end of the day, owing to decades of history with academic researchers and tech transfer offices, which frequently were misaligned. There's been a great effort over the last 5 to 10 years that I've seen by most universities to really bring on folks that are empowered, resourced, and experienced to help academic scientists commercialize their discoveries. It's a challenging position. As I mentioned in my remarks, there's a sense of emotion and propriety in academic discovery. And unfortunately, what we see is probably less than 20% of everything we do is everything we see in a tech transfer office even going to get licensed. And of the 20% that gets licensed, probably a small percentage, less than 5% of that is ever going to drive any revenue. And the ones that are going to drive meaningful revenue, I don't, as the saying goes, need to take my shoes and socks off to count. So there's a lot of moving parts to that. If you're in an institution that doesn't have those skill sets in your office, I think it's important to help senior administration know that the importance of having that support, that partnership, at least that's how we think about it at Utah, between the folks that manage commercialization and do the academic science is critical. So it does vary, but I do think increasingly you're seeing truly experienced talent coming in and helping these scientific discoveries get to market.
Thanks, Keith. So this question kind of goes along with Project Catalyst and what we hope to create. But I know that there are tons of accelerators out there that are doing the same thing. But what happens if I'm not part of an accelerator? I'm not part of it. There are people, they don't start their companies in garages, but they don't necessarily start their companies out of academia. And, are there places that they can go to learn the business or learn this language, or so that, these term sheets, they don't get completely befuddled, or regulatory. I mean, the regulatory language, even though it's regulatory science, sometimes doesn't seem very scientific.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, it's not like you can just sort of cruise down to the supermarket and know that you're always going to find the products you're looking for. In more mature ecosystems like the Bay Area or Boston, obviously, there are a lot more folks that you can, quote, bump into that can serve as advisors or mentors. But in my experience, but the tech transfer office, actually, if you're in a university setting, is obviously a great source of connecting with mentors. But if you're not, in most cities, large, small, medium, there are a lot of economic development agencies that deal in deep tech, of which therapeutics would fall into. They're state-driven or municipality-driven. In Utah, for example, we have the Economic Development Corporation of Utah. We have our trade association, BioUtah, which there are similar ones in almost every state. And so, reaching out and simply saying, are there programs that I can connect to meet folks, to go to events. Even if you're not thinking about it in terms of formal networking, just being around and spending time in the ecosystem is critical. I sort of spoke to the multilingualism. It doesn't happen overnight. You've got to just put yourself out there and network, and you meet folks over time. And so the typical ability to reach out to 2-3 organizations that most cities and states have, and then just get involved by attending some events and getting to meet people, network openly, not selfishly, is also the other advice that I give. Is don't go out with the expressed goal of, I've got to meet 4 people who can sit on my board, who can do X and Y and Z. Those things are oftentimes needs and will come in time, but you don't know that the first 4 people you're going to meet are the right 4 people. And unfortunately, I've seen too many times where sometimes the folks you meet are actually consultants or less experienced, and they want to get paid by companies that are fledgling and don't have the funds. So take the time to get to know the folks in the ecosystem, build the trusted relationships, and do this well in advance of when you need these people around you. Do it from the beginning. And that way there's no time pressure that's driving an urgency to get to know these people, and that's where we tend to see mistakes be made.
Great, thanks. So here's a question from the audience, and it's a astute one. When are founders, CEOs also successful when the company matures to commercialization? And as you point out, all scientists don't necessarily make good CEOs, but also that an early startup CEO versus the big if a company were to actually I don't expect most of the startups to ever become real drug companies, but to get bought out. But there are some that actually try to go on to become actual companies that that aren't intended to get bought out. And I just wonder how many scientists find that a rewarding creative endeavor.
Here's a situation. I can use myself as an example. I've been a company founder several times. I got to a point in my own company as CEO and built it to multi-million dollars annual revenues, whatnot, and I was not interested in taking the company to the next level, nor was I probably the right individual to try. It wasn't my experience, and if I'm being super candid, it was sort of boring to me. And so I worked with our board, and we recruited a CEO who had that next level experience. It's very individual. I can't say there's nobody who can go from startup to $1 billion exit. There are absolutely folks that can do that. It varies. And typically the variations depend on the things that we were just talking about, folks' ability to grow, expand, become conversant in these capabilities. So this is definitely not a one-size-fits-all endeavor.
Great. Thanks, Keith. That's about all the time we have for questions and answers with Keith. And once again, I want to thank you so much for participating and bringing your practice perspective to all of us. That was hopeful and refreshing. And now I'm going to turn this back over to our SBI host,